Hello everybody, I've had lots of requests to make a video on the basics of making bread, so today we're going to make a basic white bread recipe. You need to first gather your ingredients, which for most bread recipes is flour, sugar, salt, yeast, oil, and milk of some form. I'm going to show you how to warm milk to make bread because you cannot use milk straight from the jug in bread. It won't work properly. You need to break down the milk protein. So I have some milk heating on the stove. I'm going to grab it. When you heat milk, what you want to do is you want to heat it up until you have bubbles starting to form around the edge of the milk. When that happens, it is warm, it has broken down the milk proteins, and you're good to go. Right now it's way too hot to use in the recipe because it will kill your yeast, so we want to let it cool down for a minute. While we're doing that, I'm going to put the other ingredients in the mixing bowl so that we can get started. I'll set this over here to cool off for starters. Okay, so to start off, you want to put about a third of the amount of flour called for in the recipe in your mixing bowl. So we'll start off doing that. We're going to start off with 4 cups of flour. Now, I like to add about 1/4 of a cup of potato flakes into my flour. That acts as a preservative and it actually gives you a nice texture to your bread. If you do not have potato flakes, you can use some boiled mashed potatoes that you've mashed. You can save the water from potatoes that you boiled. Just keep it in the fridge, and then when you're ready to use it, warm it up for a minute in the microwave so it's lukewarm. Any of that will work. The potato just gives it a nice texture and it helps to preserve it. So we have our flour and our potato flakes in our bowl. Next, you want to sprinkle some yeast on top of that. When your recipe calls for 1 package of yeast, that is 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. I am actually 1.5 timesing this recipe so I can show you some different techniques. So I'm going to use a tablespoon of yeast for that. And just a hair more, just a hair, maybe that much, 1/4 of a teaspoon. Okay, so we have that. Now, if you're concerned that your yeast is maybe been sitting for too long in your cupboard and isn't going to work, you can fill a cup with a 1/4 cup of warm water, sprinkle just a little bit of sugar in it, and sprinkle some yeast on top. Let it sit for 5 minutes. If your yeast is foamy and kind of thick looking, it's good to go. If it's still granular and it hasn't changed at all, you should probably throw your yeast away and get new yeast. Now, I like to buy my yeast in bulk. It's way cheaper than the little packets. But to keep it fresh and active, I always store my yeast in the freezer. And I usually pour from the big bag into my little jar and then just put my little jar in the fridge. That way it's there when I need it and comes to room temperature faster. All right, so we've got those 3 main ingredients in there. The next thing you want to do is you want to mix your sugar that's called for in the recipe into your milk that's cooling down so that it can dissolve. This recipe that I'm using calls for quite a bit of sugar, but I'm just going to go with about 1/3 of a cup. There are bread recipes that call for less sugar. This is kind of an all-purpose bread recipe. Stir that sugar in. All-purpose bread recipes can be used to make hamburger buns, cinnamon rolls, cinnamon raisin bread. You can use it, it's a little more versatile. So mix in your sugar. Then you also want to mix your salt into the milk. So you don't want to mix salt and yeast directly because salt will actually inhibit the growth of your yeast. Sugar feeds it, salt inhibits it. So it's good to keep those separate. So I'm going to put the salt in the milk mixture. And we'll just stir that in for a minute. All right, so this is still a little bit on the warmish side. So a lot of bread recipes call for milk and water. So what I do is I just measure my water out and then I add it into the milk, and that kind of evens out the temperature. So I'm going to get some lukewarm water. The best way to test that is to run it on the inside of your wrist. It should be bathtub warm, baby bathtub warm. It should be just warm enough to run over your wrist but not burn it in any way. So we'll measure that out. We'll stir that in. Most bread recipes, all bread recipes, use some sort of fat. Fat gives you a nice crumb and a good texture to your bread. You can use butter, you can use vegetable shortening, you can use oil. Today I'm going to use oil because that's just quick and easy. So we need 1/3 cup of that. We'll stir that in. So you stir all of those ingredients together. When they're fairly combined, you pour them into the flour mixture. Scrape your bowl to make sure that you get all the sugar and everything out of the bottom of the pan. All right, now you want to put the mixing bowl on the mixer. If you do not have a stand mixer, you can do all of this by hand. Just get a nice wooden spoon and start stirring. Keep stirring until it is smooth, kind of like cake batter. So we're going to turn this on and let that do its thing. It should take just a couple minutes. Now I want to talk a minute. So I told you that milk needs to be warmed up until it forms bubbles around the edge to break down the milk proteins. I am lazy, so I just buy powdered milk and I use 1/3 cup of powdered milk plus 1 cup of warm water for every cup of milk called for in the recipe. It's just easier. You don't have to warm anything up. You just dump the powdered milk in with the flour and then just add the water into the bowl like we just did for the wet milk. That seems to work the best. So you can buy powdered milk in any baking aisle. You can, if you have a grocery store that has a bulk section, a lot of times you can buy it in the bulk section. So it's cheap. All right, we've got this mixed up. I'm going to show you what it looks like. So that is what it looks like when it's all mixed together. It looks like cake batter. So we're going to scrape our blade and we're going to put in a dough hook. If you're doing this by hand, just continue adding flour into your bowl, 1/2 cup at a time, and stir with your spoon. Okay, got that done. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in the sink. I'm going to add another cup of flour into that mixture, put it back on the bowl, and add in my dough hook. All right, I'm going to let that start mixing up. Now, as you're mixing in your flour, it's really important not to dump the whole amount of flour in the recipe into the bowl at one time. It overwhelms the liquid and it will lead to dense bread. So I'm going to stop right here for a minute. Okay, just keep adding flour in small increments and just keep kneading it. You want to keep doing that, and the dough should start to form a ball around the dough hook. It's going to be really sticky at first, so just keep adding flour. This takes a minute. It's not instant gratification, so you pretty much have to keep on keeping on. Thing I want to talk about with bread flour. So all recipes give you a guesstimate. Usually, for instance, 5.5 to 7 cups of flour. With bread, it's important that you don't assume that you need to add all of the flour in. What happens if you put too much flour in a bread dough, it's very dense and heavy, it won't rise properly, and you'll have really heavy, crumbly bread that is impossible to make into anything other than toast. So, you want to assume that you're going to use the least amount of flour called for in the recipe. As you get close to adding that least amount into the dough and it starts to form a ball, you want to monitor it pretty close. You want it to be a soft ball, not really sticky, but not your mixer shouldn't really be having a hard time mixing it. If you're mixing it by hand, it will get harder to stir with the spoon as you go on. So you're going to want to keep stirring until your arm starts to hurt and a ball of dough starts to form, and then you're going to knead the rest of the dough in if you're doing it by hand. If you're doing it the lazy way in a mixer, you can keep adding flour until just about the end when you need just enough to get a feel for what the dough feels like. So it's starting to form a ball now, which is good. We're adding our flour in. It's still pretty soft though. It needs more flour for sure. Just keep on keeping on. Okay. So when you flour, you can use bread flour, but all-purpose flour will work too. So it's just your preference. I use all-purpose flour. I think it works just fine. It seems to make good bread, and it's cheaper than bread flour, and usually easier to find. All right, this is looking pretty good, actually. It's starting to form a good ball of dough around the hook. So I'm going to let that mix in for a second. Then I'm going to knead it by hand so that you can see the basic technique for that. Alright, so when you knead dough, when it comes out of the mixer or when it's starting to get really rough for you to mix it by hand and you need to knead it, you want to put flour on the surface that you're going to knead the dough on. I bought this silicone mat from Pampered Chef. I'm not affiliated with Pampered Chef, but I bought this 1,000 years ago, and that's what I use to knead my dough on. You can do it right on your counter. You can do it on a large breadboard. It's just whatever you would like. So we're going to take this and see how it's pretty sticky, pretty soft. So it's going to need more bread or more flour kneaded into it. So we're going to scrape it off the hook. Just like this. Get as much off as you can. You don't want to waste that dough. You're working hard for that dough. All right. So you want to dump your dough onto the floured surface. Get it all out onto the Bread dough is notoriously sticky and kind of a little bit hard to work with at first, so don't get discouraged. Just keep scraping and kind of working it out of the bowl. All right. There we go. Okay, so when you need bread dough, you kind of want to keep it in this ball form, but see how it's sticky and it's sticking to my hands? We need to work on that a little. So sprinkle a little flour on it, fold it over, and push down. And then use the heels of your hands to push and mix the flour on the counter or your baking mat and just knead it. So as you knead in the flour, you're working towards a smooth elastic ball. But see, it's still sticky, so it needs more flour. So we add a little more, kind of roll that dough over, get some flour on it, then push, fold, push, and just keep working it in. This is good for your upper arm strength too. We'll call this arm day. Keep kneading it in. It's starting to get a lot smoother and not so sticky. So we'll keep going. Now, the important part when you're kneading flour in, as soon as you get a firm ball of dough that's not really sticky anymore, that's when you want to stop. Don't add any more flour. It's better to have a little bit less flour mixed in than a little bit too much. So keep working your dough, push in, fold in, work out all your frustrations. This is a good quarantine activity. When your kids are driving you nuts, just go knead some dough. Works it all out. Okay, this is starting to feel really good. So see, it's not sticking to my hands anymore. It's holding its shape, and it's not feeling sticky. It's feeling pretty smooth, which is what you want. You need to let this dough rest, and you need to let it double in size. Basically, you need to let the yeast do its job. That usually, depending on the temperature of your home, takes between 45 minutes to an hour and 20 minutes. If your house is really cold, I would suggest that you set it someplace warmer. Maybe turn the oven on for a minute, let it heat up just until it's warm inside, then shut the temperature off and just let it rise in there. I actually have an old-fashioned electric heating pad. I just plug that in, set it on the heating pad, warms it right up. Okay, we have our dough. It's all nice. It's ready. So we're going to put that in a greased bowl. Any bowl will work. Glass, metal, doesn't matter. Just you need a bowl that's large enough to hold the dough. Now this dough is going to double in size over the next hour-ish. So you want to have a bowl big enough that it will rise to the top but not start going over the sides. So we're going to set that in there. Put a little bit of cooking spray on it. And then you're going to want to cover it. The best thing to cover them with is a lint-free towel, like a flour sack dish towel. So you just put that over. That keeps the dough from drying out, and it keeps the heat in and allows the dough to rise. So we're going to let that raise, and then we'll go on to the next step. Okay, our dough is risen, and a great way to tell if your dough has risen enough is to take a clean finger and push it into the dough. When you make that indentation right there, if the indentation stays deflated and doesn't want to rise anymore, your dough has risen enough. So, first things first, flour your surface. I always keep a little extra flour in a pint mason jar with a cap that I stole off of a Parmesan cheese jar. Works great for sprinkling. You can sprinkle or pour. So they just screw right on to your mason jar. All right. You're going to want to grease your bread pans. Any bread pan will work great. Metal, glass, Pyrex. I prefer thrift store vintage bread pans. These are Corningware. I also like Pyrex baking bread pans. They seem to give you an even bake and they clean up beautifully. So we're just going to spray our bread pans. All right, now we're going to dump our dough onto our floured surface and push the air out of it. All right, like I said, I 1.5 timed this recipe so that it would make 3 loaves of bread. So I want to divide that into 3 equal sections. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you kind of want it to be fairly equal. So just divide that. You can do this with a sharp knife, or you can do it like this with your fingers and just squeeze it. This is just a little dough knife. I think I bought it at Walmart. So anyway, you just want to get your 3 balls of dough or your 2 balls of dough, or however much your recipe makes. Kind of roll them into a ball. Make sure they're fairly equal. Okay. So I'm going to show you for starters. We're just going to roll this into a ball of dough. There's 2 ways of doing it. You can roll it out, or you can just kind of work it with your fingers. You want to get all the bubbles out of your dough. That's really important. If you have bubbles in your dough, what's going to happen is it's going to leave holes in your bread when it has risen and baked. So make sure you don't have any bubbles. Just kind of push down on them, squish them out. Kind of form this into a rectangle, and then just push and roll, push, there's a bubble, push and roll till you get to the end. Push down, then you have a seam right there. You want to pinch that and seal it. So just keep pinching, then push your end in, tuck it over, and pinch. Just like that. Okay. Then I always like to slap it down just because that's how my grandma taught me how to do it. Make sure you don't have any bubbles. And then put that in your loaf pan. Just set it in there and push it down a little bit. Okay. You can do it that way, or you can roll it with a rolling pin. Just set it down there, roll. You can hear those bubbles popping. Kind of satisfying, actually. Just kind of roll it into a rectangular shape. Push down as you roll because you want to pop those bubbles. That's really, really important. You want to get all of those out if you possibly can. Now, basic bread dough can be used for all sorts of things. You can make regular loaves of bread. You can make cinnamon raisin bread, which I'm just going to show you how to do that right now. So you make sure that your dough is rolled out. Then you take softened butter and you just kind of smash it on the back of the spoon and roll, just frost your bread dough with the butter. If you don't have or don't want to use butter, you can use evaporated milk. You just want something on the dough so that the cinnamon and sugar will stick. So just spread that all over. till you've got it fairly evenly spread on your dough. Just like that. Then take some sugar. I'm going to sprinkle that right over the butter. So just get a little on a measuring cup and just lightly sprinkle, just like you were making cinnamon rolls. Sprinkle that over like that. This bread is excellent for making French toast or for toasting for breakfast. All right, once you've done that, grab your cinnamon and just sprinkle some cinnamon over the top of that. You can add as little or as much as you would like. It's your preference. Then take your dough and roll it up. Push down, roll up. So you get it to the end, push it down. You kind of really want to push it if you're making cinnamon swirl bread because you want the roll to kind of stick together. So when you bake your bread, it doesn't come apart. So do the same technique. Tuck the ends in, pull them over like that, pinch it. Get them nice and sealed. All right, and give them a good slap and put it in your bread pan. All right, the third thing, so if you're gonna just kind of brush that off. Okay, so you can also turn these into rolls or hamburger buns. So we are having hamburgers for dinner tonight, so I'm going to turn these into rolls. So just knead out your roll this into kind of a circle. Pinch out the bubbles. Kind of like you were rolling out a pie crust. You want to roll this into a circle. Hear those bubbles popping. Just kind of get as many bubbles as you can out. Keep working with it. It doesn't have to be a perfect circle, obviously, because mine is kind of a circle rectangle. So when you get that pretty flat, all right, you can take your pizza cutter, which is the easiest way to do this, and cut it into quarters, and then cut that quarter in half, like that. Then take from the longest edge of your triangle, roll it, pinch the corner, and then pull your ends over, pinch them, and smash. Put those on a baking sheet. Roll all of these up like that. Just bring them around, push. If you don't want to do them this way, you can just turn them into a circle shape, just a dough shape like that. So it's kind of a flat disc, and just bake them that way. It's whatever you prefer. Just roll from fat to skinny, push them around, and push that all together. All right. Do a couple more just in the circle shape, the disc shape. Just roll it with your fingers till you get it nice and the way you want it. Set it on there. So really, Basic white bread dough, any recipe you want to follow, you can use it for a variety of things. So you can do all of your own home baking, especially if, like right now, we're in quarantine and for a while there were no loaves of bread anywhere to be found. You can make your own bread, or if you run out and you thought you had some in the freezer and you realize you don't, you can just hurry and whip up a batch of your own. This is super versatile. So it's just whatever you want to do. All right. After you get your dough shaped in whatever you're going to use it for, rolls, hamburger or hot dog buns, bread, you want to let it rise. So you need to cover that just like we did the dough to keep the heat and the moisture in. I like to use wax paper that I spray with a little bit of cooking spray to cover my rolls so that I don't ruin my dish towels. So just pull some off. And by the way, I'm not spraying on my floor. If you open the door of your dishwasher and spray your cooking spray on whatever towards the door, you don't make a mess, you don't spray your floor or your counter and have to scrub it off. All right. Okay, just gonna cover those. We're gonna cover them back with the dish towel and we're gonna let them rise. Right, your bread should take between 35 minutes to an hour to raise, to double in size. It just depends on the temperature of your kitchen. Usually I've found it takes about 45 minutes as an average rule. So we're gonna let that sit for 45 minutes and then we'll bake it. Okay, so the bread dough has been raising for about 45 minutes now. So it's ready to put in the oven. I've preheated my oven to 375 degrees. Most breads need to be baked right around 375. So I'm going to uncover the rolls and the bread. As you can see, the rolls have about doubled in size and the bread has risen to fill up the bread pan and it's just above the line of the bread pan. You want your bread to be about 1/2 inch to 1 inch above the bread loaf pan. What's going to happen is when you put that bread in the oven, the yeast is going to give a final rise. It's a really rapid rise, and so you will get more height on your bread and a bigger size on your rolls. If you have your bread dough risen up too high over your loaf pan, what can happen is you get a really crumbly, airy loaf of bread that doesn't cut well, and it's almost impossible to put any kind of butter or peanut butter on, or it's overproofed and it will collapse on you. So we're gonna go ahead and put these in the oven. I'm gonna bring these over here. Now you want to make sure that your rack of your oven is in the center of your oven. That's important because you want a good round even heat. So I'm going to place the loaves in here and I'm going to put the rolls in real quick. Get it all in there. All right. Close the door. Now you want to set the timer on your oven for 25 to 30 minutes. That's about how long it takes to bake a loaf of bread. You might have to adjust it a little. If you like a lighter colored loaf, then you may go with a little less time. If you like a darker colored loaf, you'll go with a little more time. So we're going to go ahead and let that bake. Then I'll pull it out of the oven and we'll take a look at it. Okay, the bread is ready to come out of the oven, so we're going to grab it. Okay, so when you take your bread out of the oven, you want to take it out of your loaf pan so that it can cool. So just gently dump it onto its side. You want to cool your bread on its side like this because it disperses the weight of the bread and it won't compact it. So just toss that out there. Let it cool off. And notice that how much difference there is in size from when I put them in the oven to when they're finished baking. They do rise quite a bit when they're in the oven. So we're going to take those out, let them cool, and then they're ready to eat. So it seems like a lot of steps, but a lot of it is waiting in between time. So I encourage you all to get your baking supplies out and give this a try. It's super easy, it's kind of therapeutic, and there's a great sense of accomplishment when you have a beautiful loaf of bread done. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.